you come on up too. And if there's any questions for any of the group, including Dr. Slew, we'll be certainly willing to answer those. Now, Dennis has got the results of the survey. Let's get those, and then we'll continue with the questions.
All right. I appreciate everyone's taking a time to return our surveys. I'm going to try to juggle all this and go through them real quickly. I think there's some interesting stories there to tell. The first question we ask you is the importance of keeping the weeds under control by keeping the clover at the same time. And we broke this down into industry segment. So we have the forage producers all the way on the left-hand side, and then other product or service providers, the seed industry, advisors. That would include folks like myself, consultants, and researchers and that sort of thing, and then pest management, and then the overall average here is at the very far end. The pest management score, I think some of the Dow guys must have answered the survey on that one. But they get that at the front lines. I mean, they get that question all the time, and I know I do. I'm sure they do too. But what I think is interesting is some of the differences here. We certainly, from an advisor standpoint, see that quite often. Forage producer, I would expect it actually that number to have been a little bit higher. Some importance of the herbicide tolerance from the forage producer respondents, I thought might have been a little bit higher than that, but it's interesting that we see that. The second question we asked was about establishment costs, and same setup here. The seed industry, I'll give them a little bit of grief. They didn't consider that quite as important as everyone else. Go figure. Go figure. But you know, forage producers certainly see that as an important characteristic, and advisors, those of us in Extension, I'm proud to see that is fairly in line with the forage producer answers, and pest management was fairly close to that too. What about stand longevity? And that's really where I think the rubber hits the road personally. Producers also see that as a very, very important characteristic. The seed industry, I'm going to give them props. The seed industry actually put that as one of the very most important factors. And actually it goes off the scale here. I think the average was about 4.2 or something like that. Pest management was right at 4.0. My point is that, you know, the seed industry, I think, does get that message about persistence. The seed growers, I hope that they also get that message as well. But I think that's an important concept here. And so that was it. Questions about the survey or other questions for us?
I know you have several questions, so we're going to take as many of them as we can in the time. One that I just noticed, Dr. Jeff Lemkuehler over here, Dennis mentioned something about bloat, and that is something of concern. And I would invite you to the University of Kentucky Forage webpage. We have a publication on there that was, 2 years ago, I think, Jeff, that we had some real problems here then. And so I think Jeff and his team pulled together an excellent publication on bloat, and I'd invite you to read that. Now, questions for anyone on the panel? Yes, Chris.
You talked about the importance of red clover, Dennis, but it looks like it didn't fare so well with the new herbicide. Can you just comment on that?
You want to repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is with the importance that Dennis indicated on red clover, yet we're not seeing that kind of tolerance. At this stage, that's something that, as I mentioned, we're seeing it come back in to areas that we're using GF 3731. However, it is always a reduction, and it's just slower to respond. Under grazing pressure, it does come back a little bit better. When the animals put pressure on the site and take care of some of that competition from the grass, it does tend to come back in a little bit faster. Scott, any comment?
A question. Okay. Any other comments on that question? Question back here.
I'm sorry? No. It has not been Kentland red clover that we've evaluated. No. As far as grazing restriction, it's too early to tell on that, but we're, we're hopeful that it would be a no grazing restriction category. But that's still up in the air.
Question, if I please speak up so we can hear it in the back, and then we'll come back in.
Yeah. Did you want to pass them the microphone?
Coming over here.
Okay, I think the question is, are we seeing any resistance from a good standpoint as far as some of the clovers? And that's something maybe Scott can comment on just because of his work with the clover nursery.
From what I've seen, especially with white clover, some of the better white clover varieties that our seed partners have developed seem to do a lot better than some of the resident clovers. So there seems to be just the characteristics they're looking for, higher yielding, higher tolerance to maybe grazing pressure, seems to convey to varieties that tend to fare well. As far as red clover goes, it's too early to tell if this can be developed through maybe recurrent selection into a variety that's tolerant to it. So
let's remind them that Byron's got a poster that talks about some varietals. Hey, Byron, you want to make a comment on anything about the poster?
So the poster is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and it will cover a number of different varieties that were tested over the last couple of years, and these are commercially available varieties of white clover that many of you are already using, and you can learn more about how they performed with this GF 3731 applied over top of them.
Question for Dr. Bates.
So, Pat or Scott, on the data that y'all showed, where you're getting almost better performance from the forage on year 2 after spraying, talk a little bit about that. Is that because it did such a good job controlling some of the residual activity, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I think the thing that we're seeing with that is, as time goes on, that weed pressure really starts to make continuous impact on the forages. Scott indicated one illustration up there about mowing late, because that's one of the comments that we've heard is producers may say, well, I know that I'm removing a lot of top growth, therefore I'll just mow late. Well, that actually shades out and creates an even greater problem down the road. So I think what we're seeing is just the continuous recovery of the forages through time, because the control is good. We see that with Graze on Next. You see the grass response, initial grass response is very good, but as Scott was saying, a lot of that decaying clover from the Graze on Next releases a lot of nitrogen, and then you get a good grass response. So I think it's just a continuous effect of the lack of competition, and really making a long-term impact on the competition that's out there.
Okay, question over here.
Dennis, does the maturity of red clover make a difference on the estrogen effect?
Yeah, great question. Yes, there is an interaction there with the maturity. The flower components tend to have a whole lot more of those isoflavones that mimic estrogen. So there is, as it gets more mature, it definitely will have an impact. That's particularly of importance if we're making silage or hay off of it. So one needs to consider that. I don't want to make it out to be a huge issue, but it can be, particularly for grazing animals that are grazing on it. They've seen some issues with sheep in particular, but also with cattle. In New Zealand and Australia, both they have issues.
Okay, just a second, Dennis. We got 2 questions back here, but one I wanted to follow up with you, Dennis. In your a lot of your economic data was based on warm season. A lot of it dominantly Bahia and Bermuda. What would you say about the data if you brought that north with more higher producing perennial clovers and cool season grasses?
Yeah, I do think that the economics are far favorable, more favorable for especially endophyte infected tall fescue, but also cool season grasses in general, if we can get that persistence out of the clover. It really needs to last 3 years or more. The one slide that I had with the seed cost and the nitrogen cost and then the stand longevity, That sets the cost, and then any differences in animal performance then would need to be judged off of that. But I think in those scenarios, generally speaking, cool season grasses are going to see a much more of an advantage there. And if you've got endophyte infected tall fescue, to me it's a no-brainer to have clover in there, clear cut. But
Okay.
some of the others, it may be a lot more of a question mark as to whether or not it's going to pay out over the long term.
Okay, another question.
We have a question on the herbicides. Do you have any data on the flowering, how the flowering is suppressed, because it might affect seed production?
So the question is around the suppression of flowering. Normally we see flowering suppressed for about 30 days. We usually start to see the flowers start to pop back up somewhere after that 30-day mark.
Okay, next question.
Dennis, do you think there is hard to measure midterm and long-term soil health benefits from the legume grass mixtures that really don't show up in the data?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I actually had a couple slides on that I took out just in the interest of time, mainly because there is no good data, okay? There's not really good data showing long-term, anyway, the benefits, not only from the soil, but also from the standpoint of animal performance over a long period of time. Probably the best shot at that is actually some of the data that we're seeing out of Texas. Even though that's warm season species, it worked for you, but it wouldn't work necessarily for where we were talking about earlier with the cool season grass-based pastures. They were seeing some subtle differences there with regard to fertility, but in terms of actual impact on biota of the soil, the different microorganisms in the soil, the data on that is very, very sparse.
Thank you, Dennis.
Are there any studies that have been done of, say, every third year, holding a pasture till it goes to seed, mowing it, and how your stands survive over time?
Great question. So one of the concerns would be allowing it to go to seed. And white clover is a very prolific seed producer. So unless you're just like severely overgrazing it, it more than likely is going to be producing enough seed that it's going to freshen up the seed bank by itself. But particularly for our annual species, our crimson clovers, the arrowleaf clovers, and that sort of thing, allowing it to go to seed even every year sometimes is a practice in certain areas. To be honest with you, I didn't really look at some of that data that much. I was trying to get more of a broader spectrum rather than looking at specifically those winter annuals. We do know that has an improvement in recovery of the species. Red clover also is one that would need to probably go to seed on occasion to be able to be most productive. Whether or not that really is going to pan out on red clover or not, I would be skeptical. Not that it couldn't, and I'm open to saying it would be, but if the data would suggest that. But it's a much longer regrowth period for it and much longer maturation period for it as to whether or not I would say, just off the top of my head, that would be profitable. White clover, I think, if you occasionally let a pasture go a little bit longer and produce a whole lot more seed, I think it would freshen it up pretty well.
Okay. And what question have we not asked concerning this new product that we should be asking?
As far as questions that further to address, I can't think of anything. We tried to cover as much of that information as we have available right now. We didn't want to miss this opportunity to speak to this group. We just feel like this is it was slightly premature in some of the announcement information that we can provide, and as far as the use practices. But as far as what we can share right now, I think we've covered it.
The next question, if Dr. Glenn Aiken has addressed this topic over his career, but Glenn just retired back a few weeks ago, so let's give Dr. Aiken a big round of applause for the many contributions he's done. Now the question.
Hey, Byron, I will go to your poster tomorrow and read it, but I have to ask, I need a preview. Did you see a lot of variation among varieties?
The variation was not huge. Basically, many of the newer varieties performed fairly similarly. The big discrepancy is several of the other speakers have mentioned common white Dutch clover just did not do as well as the new and more improved varieties that are out there. So for years, Agronomy 101, get a good variety. Yeah.
I know there was another question right here, and then I'll get back over there. While I'm coming over here, Dennis, let me go back and make sure. That first speaker indicated that in his state, I think he was talking about Kentucky, that red clover had been the dominant legume for renovation for 50 years. Now, the average stand life in Kentucky over that 50 years has been about 2 winters out of it. So have we been losing money for 50 years?
You know, it's really hard when your mentor asks you such a challenging question. Yeah, it depends. I'll give the extension answer. He taught me that one too. No, I don't think so. Over those many years, I think in that case you're dealing with a much more productive species. Red clover is much more productive than white clover. However, I would say that the biggest benefit is from the fact that you're improving the quality of that fescue that's infected with the endophyte, and that toxin load that you're getting. I think you are offsetting or at least improving the quality of what you're taking in. And so in that scenario, I think you definitely are. Had orchard grass or bluegrass be the complete, the coverage across of Kentucky, would we have had that same economic benefit from putting red clover in there? I think that's a very hard question, and I'm not sure if it was all Kentucky Kentucky bluegrass instead of Kentucky 31 that we would have seen the benefit of 2 years worth of clover and red clover, and then it playing out.
Question.
Pat, you mentioned that we're trying to manage for an early cereal stage. If this herbicide is developed and available, should we be thinking in terms of prophylactic use on some kind of frequency? And what do you think that frequency might be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, encouraging some of the more productive clovers right now, using the techniques that we have, some type of a renovation operation, is going to help us. And then maintaining the stand longevity that we want to reach for, because many of these sites, when they become so infested, like what we were seeing in some of those images, you're losing the clover over time. And so that frequency of application, we'll hone in on a little bit more. We wanted to look at, first of all, how are we going to reclaim some of these sites? And once you get them into that stage, just the amount of control that we're seeing from in some of these weed populations for 1 year, could you take them back to a more dominant grass clover mix and then just use it infrequently after that? I think that's something we'll be learning as we go forward. But certainly the 2 years in a row, when we're reclaiming some of these sites, they're really in bad shape. I mean, that's what we look for. We look for the bad and the ugly, and some of it's the really ugly. And so I think that we'll probably have to use it more frequently initially, and then we'll learn how frequent after that.
I want to say just a comment on top of that. One of the things I see from a practical standpoint of the use of Grazon is that you can't go right back with clover, of course. With this product, it seems to me that those clovers are growing rapidly enough to fill in some of the voids that the weeds are making. And I think that makes a huge difference in the recovery, as well as potentially also translating to performance as well.
Thank you. Dr. Don Bob.
Hey, Dennis, great presentation as always. Congratulations on that. But the issue of economics, you talked about quite a bit, and just a couple minutes ago we were discussing that. Maybe I misunderstood this or misread the slide, but I thought you had an establishment cost of $167 per acre, clover establishment cost. Was that correct?
That's
It seemed a little on the high side to me.
it is okay, but let me defend those numbers. And again, I would encourage you to pull up that spreadsheet. If anybody's interested, you can go in and plug your own numbers in there. Okay. It actually, and it gets back to Gary's question earlier about putting out red clover, for example. Red clover into tall fescue, the way I did it growing up in Western Kentucky is we frost seeded it in January, February time frame, and that doesn't cost that much, okay? Going over with a no-till drill, putting in crimson clover and ryegrass into Bermuda grass is quite a bit more expensive. So what I did there was kind of a compromise number between them. So there are some it's conservative. It's really middle of the road approach that really underestimates some, overestimates others. So you're right. Now, especially with regard to to red clover and white clover, which we frequently would overseed, our establishment costs are going to be quite a bit lower. It also assumes, by the way, a medium P and K value in the soil. And if we fertilize according to our soil test recommendations, not everybody does that, I realize that, but if we do, then there's a significant cost associated with that as well. I would also argue, though, that if we put out clover in marginal, soil fertility soil, then we are just throwing that money out there for nothing, because if we don't take care of it, we don't apply fertility to take care of that seedling as it's getting going, then we may just be throwing good money after bad as well. So
these have all been excellent questions, and we've had great discussion. I wish we had another hour to do it, but I have a few announcements at the end. But the last question will be asked by former AFGC President Bill Tucker.
Thank you, Gary. The biggest challenge that I find as a producer is that there's only one May 10th. If I had 45 May 10ths with all this knowledge and empowerment that you guys bring us from a lot of different vendor sources and research communities, I could get it all done right. But on May 10th, I have 45 optimum time jobs to do. As you all are looking at your various trials developing this product, can you speak a little bit about how wide our windows of opportunity are going to be, so that those of us in the practical world that have to try and get it done can start being thoughtful about how best to utilize the product?
Well, Bill, that's a great comment, and that's something that we are trying to do. As you miss that optimum window of application, and that could be back to the question earlier: why did we have such a long time before we saw a response, or why did we see a response in year 2, even though we just measured it in year 2? And I think we still have a wider window of application. It's just how soon you're going to get a response from that, and where are you going to get the forage value from that. And I think that in the particular case of the Virginia site, it was treated late. It was treated late in the year. It was around the first part of July where that application was made. We didn't do a forage response that year. We could see that there was more grass production. The cattle did break through that fence as well. They'll find a way in. They push a small young calf into the fence and get it taken care of. So there are, I think we'll still work to broaden that window, and it may employ something where we do have to mow it prior to the application to bring it back into a more vegetative state in preparation for application. We see that with ironweed. If it goes to flower, it's much better to go ahead and mow that down, let it grow back vegetatively, and make the application. So we could broaden that window of application by just using some cultural practice like mowing.
Thank you, Pat. Dr. Sloop.
I'd just like to close by capturing on a couple of comments that I've heard several of you mention. When is this going to be registered? And Pat mentioned how long we've been working on this. And you often will hear, oh, there's nothing new, there's nothing new. industry average for a new active ingredient for pest management is 11 years, $286 million before the first jug is sold. And that's an average. So that means probably somebody got there in 7 years and paid $100 million, but somebody is getting there in 15 years and paying $500 million. So this is really expensive. But in the meantime, while Pat and Scott and all of our colleagues are doing this work in the field, we also have a group of very smart folks who are chemists who are working on the formulations, people in marketing, we have people in regulatory making sure that this will cross the ever-increasing hurdles that we have to cross in this industry to get a product to market. But most importantly, we have very curious long-term customers that want to know, when is this going to be available? And we want to make sure, whether it's this product or any other one, when it becomes available, it does what we say it's going to do, and that you're going to be satisfied with it, and that all of us, at the end of the day, can feel like this thing actually worked. So keep the pressure up. Keep asking the questions of your extension agents. Keep asking the questions of your reps, whether it's from your seed company, your fertilizer provider, whomever, because those things help to drive research decisions and discussions that go on in industry. So keep it up, and I'm sure there'll be lots of new things that will be in the pipeline as well. Again, thank you.
And let's give Dow AgroSciences and all the speakers this morning and Greg